Yeah, thank you so much. Well, we're really excited about today's session. And before I ask our panel members to introduce themselves, let me just set the scene. Today, we're going to be talking about making sense of data and how to tackle the data problem today to improve standards for the future. It may be asked that if AI research has already produced mature technologies and this field is now potentially ready for standardization, what can we do to get best practice in organizing and implementing AI? In today's session, this situation of AI in the context of needs of standardization is something we're going to dive into by making sense of data initially and then moving the conversation forward. Many standards in development organizations worldwide work on norms for AI in artificial intelligence technologies and AI-related practices. At the same time, governments, companies, and many other organizations massively invest in research on AI. Today, we've assembled representatives working across technology and sectors to bring together the power of AI for their businesses to serve the organizational goals, as well as benefiting us, the consumer. So joining today, we have Vishal, Paul, and Mark to really discuss and dive into the conversation around frameworks for AI standards and how those kind of standards are growing. And with our epic panel, I'm going to ask Vishal just to introduce yourself and welcome you to say hello.
Hi, thanks, Anushka, and great to be here. I'm Vishal Chatrath. I'm the co-founder and CEO at Secondmind. And we are a Cambridge-based company, 90 staff. We've been around since 2016. The two interests that we have are the short-term interests in AI and machine learning, how to make it useful in a world where the data that we have is sparse, it's not fantastically well recorded. And for typical business problems that we are solving, we have tens or even hundreds of data points rather than kind of millions upon millions, which people assume there are. And the second interest we have as Secondmind is how do we look a bit further into the future and think about how to make AI and machine learning ubiquitous, where it really becomes a part of the fabric of our society. And for that, there are some challenges that we need to address, the same way we addressed them in the world of mobile communications 20 years ago around standardization. And I'm specifically interested in standardization around data schema. And I'll talk more about that later.
Fantastic. Paul, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Sure. Paul Clarke, Chief Technology Officer at Ocado. Those of you who don't know us, I mean, historically, we're known as being a grocery retailer, but we're an international platform provider for some of the largest and most innovative retailers around the world, helping them, do online grocery scalably, sustainably, and profitably, as we've done for ourselves. And that platform business and our other activities as a technology business run on data and on machine learning and AI and on digital twins and cloud and IoT. And I suppose, one way to describe what we do is we design, build, and operate smart machines at scale, now indeed around the world. And so, very interested in the whole area of standardization, both for Ocado, but also because some of the other hats I wear, like being a member of the AI Council and the Robotics Growth Partnership and some others, this is a really important area, the whole area of this kind of data machine learning infrastructure that we need to build at a national scale and indeed at a planetary scale.
Thank you so much. Mark, welcome. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, Anushka. So Mark Buckle, Head of LogTech Innovation at Kuehne+Nagel. For those of you who haven't come across the name Kuehne+Nagel before, we are a leading global provider of innovative and fully integrated supply chain solutions. My role today is managing the global innovation portfolio and the practical application of new technologies, AI being one of those. Currently based in Switzerland, working at Kuehne+Nagel's head office in Zurich. We're currently deploying AI in many areas of the business, most notably on our digital platforms, matching customer demand with supply, making data actionable within documents and images. There's some topics and projects on the go from an email recognition point of view, and we're also using AI to predict customer demand. So super excited to be part of this discussion today, and looking forward to some fruitful discussions.
Fantastic, thank you so much. I thought it'd be really good to sort of start with a kind of, it sounds a very simple question to ask, but it's really around making data good and ensuring that we have good data sets. Also finding data where in your business you may have gaps for it. I'd love to talk about how we can empower companies to embrace artificial intelligence when the data they've got might be imperfect. And I think this is a perfect time for Vishal and Mark maybe to come together and talk about the work you've done together around the supply chain and logistics.
Yep, absolutely. So I'll probably give the perspective as a technology provider and hand over to Mark as the business expert. So from our perspective, what was very interesting and unique when we started to work in supply chain and logistics is just to be able to understand the kind of data that we are talking about. So there was a fallacy sort of going around that the world is replete with massive amount of data and big amount of data, and with big data you can do use deep neural nets or all sorts of other fancy bits to come to certain results. And that might be true for certain sectors, but definitely in some areas of supply chain we didn't see that, because while companies like Kuehne+Nagel, they do ship 30,000 or they manage 30,000 containers a day, and at a macro level there might be a lot of data. From a decision-making perspective, what really becomes important where to add value is that for a particular trade lane specific to a particular container and a customer, how much data do you have? And what we saw was that for the last few years, and which is much representative of how supply chains work, the data and activity is very bursty. So if I was to give an example of apparel, you will have spring, summer, autumn, winter collections. So you will have lots of zeros in terms of containers shipped by a particular customer to a particular location, a spike, kind of lots of zeros and spike. And that you can't apply any traditional AI and machine learning models, whether it's deep neural nets, whether it's any of the traditional forecasting ways. So you have to come up with a completely new way of thinking by using a combination of probabilistic forecasting techniques together with human experience and human knowledge to build up a tool where humans and machines could work together, and we could achieve some sense and some kind of useful output that was beneficial to Kuehne+Nagel. Mark, would you want to expand on that?
Yeah, sure. So I would like to answer the question first of all a bit more broadly. Firstly, I think I would say that AI is part of the solution to resolve imperfect data environments, and it isn't dependent on having a perfect data environment in the first place. That caused quite a bit of debate at first around when is the right time to start. But our experience showed us that you can start even within an imperfect situation. So how do we empower companies to embrace AI? Well, I think the first part of this is education, regardless of the size of the company, small, medium, or large. You need to at first understand AI, how it can be applied, and the use cases that exist around the business that can be tackled, and the size of the pie, the size of the value that exists. So once we got to that point, we then explored the marketplace, and we found a company like Secondmind. And they stood out from the rest because they really came across as being experts in applying AI models with sparse data sets, as Vishal has just referred to. So we started off with predicting customer demand. And what we found to be very useful within all of this was actually there are many data sources that can be used in theory to predict customer demand, right the way from historic order information to future to booking data that's coming up on the short-term horizon, market indices, weather and news data, seasonality data. All of these data sets in theory should impact on demand forecast. But actually going through this AI practical project enabled us to go data source by data source and determine what data was actually just noise and what was the data that was reliable and would have a positive impact on the forecasts that we needed to produce.
It's really interesting that you bring up noise. I mean, I've been looking at data sets from satellites, and one person's noise is another person's goldmine of data.
Exactly.
And actually, that's really helping to tackle the issue of space debris, which is very integral, going forward as more satellites get launched. I think the biggest disruptor right now has been COVID, right? And the whole pandemic situation that we all find ourselves in as leaders in the ecosystem in our respective roles. And I think there was actually a report published by the RSA that COVID-19 could rapidly accelerate the pace of technological change. And Paul, you sit in a role where you openly talk about really being like having a stealth disruptive team that's constantly internally self-disrupting. What has the crisis taught us about data and the infrastructure that we need to support it?
Well, I suppose in terms of our own business, we were, lucky to have invested a lot in building that infrastructure for ourselves, whether it be, the kind of the synthetic in modeling environments or the way in which we collect our data and use the kind of the data exhaust from our swarms of smart machines and our warehouses to optimize those processes. But I suppose looking out, I think one of the early reflections more nationally was that we were missing a lot of the data infrastructure to facilitate and control secure data sharing across, not just for open data, but for all kinds of data sets, including data sets where people won't share them unless they know who they're sharing them with and for what purposes. And in some cases, at what cost, because some data will be chargeable. So it's about the data trusts, the data marks, but also the data passports, for that. And then, really it's on to the importance of the standards that, need to underpin that. So things like the data ontologies, the data dictionaries, so that we can join up these data sets to drive insights. If we had more data, we could have done more interesting things in this pandemic with AI and machine learning at a national scale. But I suppose one of the areas I'm most interested in is feeding these data into digital twins or digital models, because I think that's probably one of the most exciting applications of AI is when you start connecting those models to virtual worlds and letting them come up with optimizations that humans would struggle to come up with.
I think digital twins are really interesting, particularly where I look at the work in research organizations, and a lot of the research and findings sort of stay in a sandbox, right? But it's historically then difficult to then transfer that research into the real world without being able to map the real world implications. Mark, Vishal, Paul, this is open to all of you. Like, how can we take the best of research, whether it's internal in your departments, in your organizations, and take it into the real world and being responsible with it? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that and perhaps bring in some of your experiences around it.
Yep. So I guess one of the things with the applied side of research and AI is what we have experienced is for AI and machine learning to be useful, domain knowledge is very, very important. So no matter what research that we do as independent technology companies or in academia, to go beyond toy problems to real world applications, really kind of half of the capability or the fact would be that we have to absolutely understand the domain And what we had the benefit of in working with Kuehne+Nagel was really have the opportunity to work very closely with people like Mark, trade managers who actually manage the business of trying to allocate capacity onto the ships. Without that, it's very hard, or or I can go so far as to say impossible to derive value, because it's a great collection of tools, but the applicability of the tools requires a lot of work with actual humans. And we also saw that in the other domains that we work on. So the time to value can be sort of accelerated by years if we have good domain expertise.
Mark, we talked a lot about keeping humans in the loop and using AI-enabled technologies to help decision-making, particularly in your organization. I wonder if you can talk about that side of things for our audience.
Yeah, sure. So one of the the key motivating factor from us with our involvement with AI comes from gaining transparency of the key supply chain trade-offs. So we need to constantly strike that balance between cost and performance. And this is why we employ the experts that we do to deliver that value to our customers. So our focus is very much looking at making good decisions systematically. And we believe that the best way to do that is to combine the human intelligence, the human expertise that have got us to this point with the machine intelligence, both at the strategic, tactical, and the operational level. Now, actually, whilst we were proceeding through this AI journey that we're on, and specifically talking about the customer demand prediction, we made progress, and then the pandemic hit, and it was quite incredible how quickly we had to pivot. Because suddenly, when you're looking at historic data as one of the key data sources to predict the future, suddenly that entire model had been ripped up in front of our noses. So the pivot then was, well, what available data sources are there that can help us deal with this changing situation that's moving from making significant shifts from a day-to-day point of view, or even hour to hour. And we got to the stage where we said, well, actually one of our most valuable and rich data sources are actually the human knowledge of real-time events that are going on right now in our environment that are being consumed by all of our experts around the world. So that's where we started to really focus on meshing together this underlying AI model with human expertise as a data source. And I'll give you an example of some of these inputs. So of course, there could be a factory closure in Taiwan. That means that demand or orders will shift geographically. And when you're talking about a demand forecast, no matter how good you are extracting historic data, that historic data will not be able to show you that exceptional event in real time. So yes, we're looking at ensuring that real-time feed of information can reach the AI model and positively impact the outcome that we're looking for.
Fantastic. Paul, do you want to maybe jump in there with maybe some of your experiences during this time?
Well, maybe to come back to your previous question about how you manage that kind of flow, that research, that flow from research through into production. I suppose what we do is we have a series of compartments. You know, they're not watertight because, you know, ideas and technologies and talent, you know, flow across them. But they are somewhat ring fenced, so that we, within those different compartments, we focus on different kind of risk, technology, and innovation kind of time horizons, if you like. And you know, a lot of the core innovation happens in our big engineering teams that are building our Ocado Smart platform, which we sell around the world. But then there's, you know, business sponsored research in robotics and AI and simulation and things like that. And then outside that, then you kind of get into my division, which is focused on the more forward-facing stuff, what you referred to earlier as the self-disruption, self-reinvention kind of agenda. But there is a flow there, and of course you have to have different ways of working and use different tools potentially, and technologies and have a different culture to drive it in those different areas. But of course, what you're trying to do is flow research through. But as we all know, when things go into production, you have to worry all about the resilience and redundancy and the plumbing and the monitoring and all of that, which has to be built in as part of the hardening process along that pipeline. I suppose that's kind of how we manage it. And I suppose one other thing that you mentioned earlier about making sure that you approach that responsibly. I think the key thing there is obviously remaining very focused on the end customer, and whether that be a B2B customer or whether that be the B2C customer, and obviously always keeping them in mind, particularly when it comes to the underlying data that's driving all of this.
Vishal, did you have anything to add there?
No, I think all those points are very well made. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting when we talk about standardization as well. When we're looking at a particular application, not all AI is the same. And to get meaningful practical guidelines for AI and use cases, we have to really think about the perspective of all of that and bringing together industries and sectors to really contribute to that discussion. And I guess in a way, we're sort of doing that today with sort of supply chain, but it is on a kind of like use by use cases. And I think you've really drawn on some really powerful themes that have come through your experiences during COVID. But I'd really love to know a little bit more from Vishal about how, growing companies such as Secondmind can really support people across different sectors, particularly where you've seen how standards have been put into the telecoms industry, for instance.
Yeah, thanks for that. So before I talk about standards in this, or the need for standards in the supply chain side, I'll give you an analog from my experience in the mobile internet space. So having started in that industry in the 1990s, I still remember being in Singapore. When I used to go to Japan, I used to rent a mobile phone, and there was no way to even send a text through that mobile phone to my family in Singapore to tell where I was. So I had to call all my colleagues to tell them where I was, because there was no interoperability between text messages. Similarly, I went to San Diego, I rented a different phone. I went to New York, I rented a different phone, and so on and so forth. So this lack of interoperability was because of lack of standards. But as of today, what we see ourselves is, from that period in 1990, from 2020, trillions of dollars of value has been created through the act of standardization, by which data schemas around how data is transmitted, the underlying layers is there, so that seamlessly, if I take a photograph on my iPhone, I can send it to Slack, pull it out of Slack, put it on WhatsApp, put it on my email, and my photograph or anything does not lose value. So there is seamless heart of information. At the same time, it is also secure. Now, when I look at the world of supply chain, while fantastic work is going on within companies, and thanks to efforts like Ocado now, when they are licensing technology also across, the work is still happening. What I would describe as basically islands, how things were in the 1990s with the mobile industry. One practical example of that is a challenge where right now I'm wearing a blue shirt, and if I was to order this blue shirt from an online retailer, if it was out of stock, there was no way for the person making the blue shirt in Bangladesh or in China to know it is out of stock, or it's about to be out of stock based on the ordering. So to proactively start ordering the materials, because the information between a Sports Direct to a Nike and all the people in between is not really shared, right? Because, and even if the information was shared, everybody has their unique way to call a blue shirt, right? Whereas in the mobile industry, if you look at one character, say if I have to put the number 2 in Arial font, because of Unicode, that notion of 2 in that particular font and in that font size is standardized. So no matter which browser or which device I use to access it, it always looks the same. Now, if you were able to standardize an element of that across the data schema, then we would improve the efficiency, not just of information flow, but also of data loss, because the other problem we have is what people like to describe as dirty data or unclean data that needs to be cleansed. And as a result of that, we have another industry called the ETL industry, where all of us spend hundreds of billions of dollars every year trying to cleanse data, extract, transform, and load, which simply should not be there, right? So in the mobile world, I have nobody transliterating and reformatting my photograph as I move it from my camera to Slack to WhatsApp. So we need to have a similar analog of that within supply chain. Is it easy? No, but we need to get started.
This is it. I'm conscious of time, and I know that we will be going into a Q&A hopefully for about 10-15 minutes when the session ends. But I'd love to know, just as we sort of close, from each of you, who would you like to take lead in creating the standards that we need? Is it something that goes across technology companies, governments, associations, standards organizations? How do we bring everyone together? And Paul, I know the work you're doing in the AI Council is fantastic, chaired by Tabitha. Where else do you see gaps? I mean, if I come to each of you very quickly, then we can continue the conversation in the Q&A with our audience.
Well, I think it's very much about a partnership. It's a partnership between, all of the different sectors, actually, private, public, NGOs, and rest of the civil society, and indeed government, in that, because although it's about, the kind of schema ontology type standards that Vishal's just been talking about, it's also very much around security and privacy and ethics, and trust. And so there's a lot to do there, as part of that standardization process. And it can only be, done, through effective partnership. And as you say, that's the agenda in part of groups like the AI Council. But there are plenty of other, stakeholders engaged in that drive for standardization, and hopefully, to build the enabling infrastructure that can help us do all sorts of, more exciting things in the future.
Fantastic. Mark, if I come to you next.
Yeah, sure. So it's difficult to argue against what Paul has just said there. The only thing I would add is, from a practical point of view, the value has to be front and center. It has to be customer centric, and we have to understand exactly what value is there to be achieved. Because to move from a theoretical partnership to something that's practical, that really makes a difference across industries, it starts and ends with what is the opportunity. And I think we can look at ourselves at this moment in time that maybe we need to spend more time on defining, out of AI, what is that value that can be delivered to the whole. And I would like the discussion to start there.
Fantastic, thank you. Vishal, any final comments?
No, I completely agree with Mark and Paul. I think value has to come first, and also as Paul mentioned, it's a collaborative effort. In the world of GSM standardization, we have the governments, the technology providers, and the technology users all come together and start working on the standards. And having participated in some of those standards in the late 90s, early 2000s, I can tell you it was maybe just slightly less painful than going to the dentist, but now looking back, it was worth it.
Yeah, I think underlining everything is a word, Paul, that you first used, and it's ethics, and really it's knowing the unknowns and knowing where to find those unknowns, and including people in the conversation where we don't know those knowns. I hope that's not too much of a riddle and too wordy, but I'd like to just take this opportunity to thank Vishal, Paul and Mark